You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. We now turn to our Reporters Roundtable. Joining us today, it's Brendan Moore with Lee Enterprises and Ben Zielinski with the Daily Line. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cole.
Always a pleasure, Cole.
Hope you guys are well rested. We had a very late night / early morning at the end of the House's session. They get the budget passed around 3:30, but then it took a whole lot longer to get the revenue and the BIMP and everything else across the finish line. Very chaotic ending to the House's session here. Brendan, I want to start with you. This is now, 6 years in the Capitol for you? Is that?
Give or take, I've been around.
Yeah, been around. So this was unique when we're getting down to procedural rules at the very end of a session. Republicans obviously trying to throw everything they could to stop that revenue bill from getting passed.
Yeah, I mean, it's not very often that Republicans who are in the super minority, it's a 78-40 split for Democrats and Republicans, that they get to influence the events in the chamber. But they did have this unique opportunity because you have one seat's vacant, Democratic seat's vacant, you had 5 members that were not here, and then you had a lot of them that either would not, or the Democrats are trying to protect them from having to vote for a tax increase in an election year. So you have these dynamics where Republicans could really, I want to say meddle or play some legislative tricks. They requested a verification of the roll call, which means you have to vote your own switch. There were 60 votes. They read the names of the yes votes. State Representative Aaron Ortiz from Chicago was not in the chamber. He was not even in Springfield anymore, so they struck him from the roll. They had to vote again. They did it again. Again, they had 60 votes, but one of the votes was a Republican who quickly dipped out of the chamber. So the Republicans struck him from the roll. So we had to do one more time, and the third time was the charm. They eventually did get it after a very chaotic scene. Really was kind of an embarrassing show for supermajority Democrats. They did not have their act together. It was a tough vote because you can argue that the tax increases that they pass are not going to hit a lot of everyday Illinoisans. I mean, we're talking about sports books, we're talking about large corporations, but it's still a tax increase, and it's an election year, and you have a lot of members that do not want to vote for that and some of them have some tougher races. So it was, I think we kind of foresaw it when you only had 65 votes on the budget, 62 on the BIMP. The revenue is probably going to be the toughest one. And they got it done. They landed the plane, but they barely avoided a crash landing.
Ben, this was such an interesting year because it was a tight budget year, trying to pass, whatever it is, it's still $900,000 or $900 million in tax increases in a budget year. That is just a headline that is going to be easily put against Democrats come November. And all of that's to say they still pass a budget with 1.6% increase in spending. And I wonder after we heard for months that revenues maybe weren't there, spending, or there might have to be some cuts. This may be difficult. We still see even higher than what Governor Pritzker proposed back in February. It was just interesting to see that be the culmination of all of this.
Right, and I think that's one of the interesting parts is that this budget is bigger than what Governor Pritzker proposed. The governor, he's always liked to talk about how his budget proposals are on the conservative side, and yet legislators, they found a way to increase the revenue to pass a more robust spending plan that's $400 million larger than what he asked for. So I think, all this talk that we saw all spring about, there might actually be budget cuts instead of a budget increase because Democrats are having a hard time getting on board with the tax plan. Obviously, we certainly saw that Democrats had a hard time getting on board with raising taxes and raising revenue to pay for their tax plan. But I think it really set up this question that a lot of legislators, including Democrats, were asking on Wednesday morning is, how are we going to be able to continue on this current pace of spending and current pace of new taxation next year when we have more holes in the budget to cover for Chicago area transit agencies, for various expenses that are continuing to rise in state government, various priorities that lawmakers have. And as Representative Fred Crespo from the Northwest Suburbs said, he essentially said that we're going to the well for taxes right now, and that's drying up another source that lawmakers could have tapped into next year when that money is arguably going to be much more needed to actually fill these budget holes.
And if I can add to that, Ben, it is more than just Republicans, and it's more than just Fred Crespo that are concerned about spending. You have Democrats, some other moderates, but also some progressive members that will tell you privately that, yeah, we are going to have some problems next year, that we are spending at a clip that may not be sustainable. I mean, you just have, those inflationary increases. I mean, you have salaries that go up. They obviously have now invested more than $2 billion in evidence-based funding since it was enacted, and pressure's going to be on to keep that investment up. And the governor was asked about it earlier this week in his end of session press conference, and he just kind of dismissed it, basically saying that they've said this every year, that it's not sustainable and that we're not going to be able to balance the budget, but we've done it every year. And that is true, at least based on what has transpired. But it is getting to a point where, I think his first budget was like $39 billion in spending, and now we're up to 53. Again, it's one of those things where, there's a lot of needs and a lot of members want to support initiatives in their districts, and it's hard to kind of keep a conservative budget in that sense when you have that many priorities you want to fund. But there is an acknowledgement, though, among a lot of folks that next year might be tough, especially if their revenues continue to slow.
Yeah, and it is very interesting, and I know there's obviously where this money kind of ends up coming from is not as simple as this. But when you look at the tax increases themselves, the amount of money that those are going to bring in, you have. It almost equates perfectly to two separate real initiatives. The amount of money that the state is having to spend is sending to Chicago, and the amount of money that was on that non-citizen health insurance plan. And also Governor Pritzker's key initiatives going forward. I mean, he's in a tight budget year. He's putting a huge investment into quantum technology, this quantum campus that he wants to build. $500 million is nothing. That's a 1% of the budget. I mean, when you're looking at it from that perspective,
right.
I know that it's not 1-to-1. I know that money is not going to that, but I'm just saying there's those legislative priorities, and then there's also the governor's priorities, and it seems like a lot of them made it into both of them, but both made it in there.
I would say, yeah, despite all of that, all those budget pressures, and all the maybe some hand wringing and some difficulty getting to the end, getting everybody on board, the governor pretty much got everything that he wanted in this session. He's used to that. I mean, he's basically gotten, I think the graduate income tax is maybe the only thing, and that was obviously the voters denied that. But yeah, from his healthcare initiative, reining in prior authorization and banning step therapy, and going after ghost networks, obviously some of his initiatives with maternal health, they all got in, and obviously Smart Start, his pre-K plan continued to be funded, evidence-based funding continued to go up. So the governor has a lot of wins, and obviously quantum. And if you talk with the governor for even a few minutes about quantum, you will know it's one of his pet projects. He loves talking about this issue, kind of uses it as the future economic development in the state. But so he got a lot. He got everything pretty much he wanted this session. But I think that as these budget pressures continue, and maybe if we see revenue to dip or to grow a little more slowly next year, that it might be more of a difficult conversation.
But again, and from his perspective, I guess it's getting closer to the end of his second term, even closer when we get to next year. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about, in the Senate especially, Brendan, you noted it a lot, but there was the talk of Pritzker using this as his political ambitions and everything like that. But we hit on it earlier. There's a lot of legislative initiatives in there as well. There's a lot of stuff that is going to help Democrats going into the November election. And it was just very interesting this year to watch those, seemingly everybody who's on the same team in this sense, battle it out and fight for that in such a pivotal election year going forward.
Right, and I think that's also the one reason you saw at least some Democrats vote no on the budget, is because they're facing tough elections in their districts. A lot of suburban legislators. Brendan mentioned Sharon Chung. She's a vulnerable downstate representative. A lot of them, I think, are a little bit wary of being looped into the headlines about tax increases or increases in spending, and I think they're kind of sensitive to, not that they don't support what's going into the budget and the governor's initiatives. I think they're just more trying to protect themselves, is why you're seeing some of this Democrat pushback. But there certainly are those who are definitely very concerned about where we're going with our budgets on the spending and the taxation. And I guess just going back to Governor Pritzker's future there, essentially on the legislative calendar, we're 2 years into his 4 years of his second term session-wise. So we're going to start probably seeing movement on his political future front, whether that's not running for governor in 2 years or running for governor for a third term. And he's going to be trying to push these initiatives that are very popular with voters, such as health insurance reform that received bipartisan support, to boost whatever it is he wants to do 2 or 4 years from now.
All right, well, we're going to come back in just a minute. I'm going to pull a House of Representatives and keep Ben and Brendan in the building a little bit longer. We'll come back and talk about some of the things that didn't get done this spring legislative session. We'll be right back.
You're watching Capitol Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. We are still here with our Reporters Roundtable. Joining us, it's Brendan Moore with Lee Enterprises and Ben Zielinski with the Daily Line. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us. I wanted to have you on to talk about the things that didn't get done as well. And Ben, I'll start with you, because we were waiting around the last morning there, wondering if the Prison Review Board reform was going to get passed. This was something that had huge bipartisan support. John Kern and Don Harmon both on it in the Senate. Kelly Cassidy was able to get 30 more sponsors added to it just to try to get this across the finish line, and it still did not even get called for a vote. What did you think of how that all transpired in that last night?
Right, the bipartisan support for it is probably one of the most interesting pieces, because Representative Cassidy is one of the most progressive-minded Democrats here, especially on criminal justice reform. And she's leading this bill that is partially at least opposed by Governor Pritzker, that would make these major reforms to the Prisoner Review Board, largely in the wake of a pretty horrific murder that happened in Chicago when the Prisoner Review Board voted to let a man out of prison, and literally the very next morning he went and tried to stab his ex-girlfriend, ended up killing her son. That really spurred lawmakers to action. They clearly saw that something had to be done, because there's been so many negative headlines about the Prisoner Review Board the last few years. And what legislators did, they tried to put together this package of legislation that encompassed a lot of different ideas proposed by Democrats, domestic violence advocates, Republicans, to improve transparency and processes on the board. And it seemed like it had a lot of good bipartisan support. The House passed one version of reform already this spring. The Senate made extra changes to that, passed out of there very easily, goes to a House committee on Tuesday night, passes out of there very easily, and then we get hung up in the House on budget talks for hours and hours and hours on Wednesday morning, and we go home essentially without reform to Prisoner Review Board for several years in a row. I think it's really just interesting how the governor was pushing back against that proposal. He opposed some of the transparency pieces, such as live streaming some of these hearings. There's a lot of concerns that he had around the cost to do that, the technology to do that. I mean, live streaming is not the easiest thing in the world, but I guess his opposition to that is definitely notable, and it would have been really interesting to see a vote and how the governor would have handled that through a veto, a mandatory veto, and if lawmakers would have come back in the fall and overridden that vote.
Yeah, and like you said, the governor's real opposition, it was interesting to hear the governor kind of saying that something was basically an unfunded mandate in the sense that's typically what he's getting a lot of the time. But that was really the argument we heard when he, on Wednesday morning, when he had his post-session wrap-up. And Brendan, I thought it was very interesting on this matter to see this all kind of develop and to know the deal, something's happening behind the scenes. Because before Representative Cassidy got all of those additional sponsors on the bill had been referred to rules, which is known pretty well as kind of the graveyard in the House of Representatives. It looked like that was it looked like that wasn't going to move. They get all the sponsors. Suddenly, it has a committee hearing. Then you're wondering, is it going to get called for? Representative Cassidy definitely thought it was going to get called for a vote. Then we get into the hours and hours. Then we get into all the chaos of the House and the roll call votes and having to overturn rules and everything. And then all of a sudden, Welch is on the floor saying, "Hey, bye, everybody." Brendan, it was interesting to watch this kind of way to see a bill die at the end of a session.
It was 5 in the morning. It was 5 in the morning, and I think it would have been very hard to keep members there any longer. I think everybody was ready to go home, but I do think that there was, the speaker bought the governor some time. I think that this is something that he's not going to be able to avoid. I mean, when you have 76 co-sponsors on a bill in the House, I mean, more than a supermajority, everybody from Kelly Cassidy to the Freedom Caucus on the right, it'll get a vote at some point. It's just a matter of, is the governor gonna support it? Is he gonna issue a veto, a mandatory veto? Will he work with the legislature during the summer on language to make it workable for them? I mean, I think that the fact that you have all those co-sponsors, the fact that it had a committee hearing that was ready to go, I mean, that sends a message. That sends a message. I mean, the unanimous vote in the Senate sends a message. And obviously, we know that the governor and the Senate have butted heads on the prisoner review board. I mean, the Senate Democrats even, not just the Republicans. But the fact that in the House you have all that support shows that, I mean, this really is a executive versus legislative, issue. And it's just a matter of, is the governor going to get to a place where there's a proposal they can accept? Because I think he's going to get one way or the other. It
was the other bill that really took up a lot more real estate at the end of session than I was expecting it to at the time was one to essentially ban certain hemp and THC Delta-8 products. This was constantly being talked about at the end of session here. This was a Kimberly Lightford bill. Senator Lightford was pushing this, and it got a couple revisions at the end and then passed the Senate, but ultimately didn't even get through the House. The concerns were that people that work in these products, these are food products or drinks that have THC or have hemp products in them, and they effectively were arguing that this would be a total ban and would kill businesses. Ben, what did you, when you were tracking this issue throughout the last few days of session, what did you think about the way that this topic just wouldn't really go away through all these negotiations?
Right. It's kind of funny. It's the second year in a row it basically ended like this. Last year we saw similar pushes in the final days to regulate hemp. Those completely stalled out because last year it was opposition from the cannabis industry. This year it seems like the opposition from the hemp industry kind of pushed this off. So it passed really easily out of the Senate. I mean, I think it had one vote against it in the Senate. But it got to the House, and there's a lot more lawmakers in the House who were certainly more sensitive to the concerns of the folks in the hemp industry who really felt like as soon as the governor signed this bill, they were going out of business, even if their THC or hemp product was as simple as hand lotion. That's how strict the bill was to some of these folks. And I think it's just kind of interesting how, it's one of those House and Senate divides again, I think, that the Senate really saw a need to regulate this. They had a lot of concerns about the Delta-8 and the ability for children to buy these things at gas stations and whatnot. And it goes over the House, and it certainly didn't seem like it had enough votes. I think Representative Ford told another media outlet that there was not enough votes there in the House to even pass this bill, which is surprising, seeing the near unanimous support in the Senate. So I think a lot of the people in the House were really just concerned about the businesses, making sure that people's livelihoods weren't just going to be completely upended by this. And they really wanted a solution that is going to be the right answer. But seeing that this is 2 years in a row where there hasn't been some sort of regulation on this Delta-8 product that has a lot of people all across the board concerned, even those in the hemp industry, I think lawmakers are really going to be pushed to action in the coming months or next session for sure.
They had a hearing last week in the Senate where they were talking about this, and this was obviously something that Senator Lightford was extremely passionate about in the moment, and they had different industries kind of coming up, and there was actually a local brewery from here in Springfield that came forward. He was in the process of getting ready to launch this hemp-infused beer that he had for this, and he's like, look, I wouldn't be able to sell this if this passes. And then a few other industries came up, like Ben was saying, products that are sold in gas stations and stuff that have this in them, and the concern is that it has too much of the product in them. Emotions got high around this. I mean, we had Senator Lightford calling somebody a drug dealer in the middle of a Senate hearing. I mean, it was just so interesting to see this topic. And like Ben said, this has been around for a while, but to see it almost is like it got kind of tied up in all the emotions that were already going on in the building.
Right. I mean, as Ben said, this is people's livelihoods, and whether we like it or not, I mean, these businesses are in all of our communities, and they employ people, and they are livelihoods for people, small business owners. But at the same time, I mean, this is going on at the same time that, alongside a very heavily regulated, very heavily taxed cannabis industry. And the folks in that industry are like, hey, why are they able to sell this, some of these heavily intoxicating products when, they're not subject to the same taxes and the same regulations that we are. And so almost from a fairness perspective, it's like, it's fine if they want to sell it, but they have to get a license like we do. They have to be taxed like we do. And so I think that's why there's been a push from the cannabis industry of like, let's get some fairness. Let's let's get some regulations, because right now there really are not a lot of regulations. And there's always veto session, so maybe this issue will come back in the fall or maybe next spring. And obviously right now there are discussions happening in Washington with the Farm Bill, seeking to clarify some of the provisions from the last Farm Bill that legalized hemp nationwide. Congresswoman Mary Miller has a bill that would ban Delta-8 essentially, kind of do on the federal level what some want to do at the state level. So I think that's also what we'll see as well. I think you're going to see state lawmakers kind of take a look and see what they do at the federal level, and perhaps that'll inform kind of what they decide to do maybe in the fall or next spring.
Well, Brendan, Ben, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cole.
Thank you, Cole.
That will do it for us on this week's episode of Capital Connection. Thank you for joining us for all of our episodes through this spring legislative session. We look forward to bringing you more throughout the summer and the fall, heading into the November general election. For Capital Connection, I'm Cole Hank.